Welcome to the 32nd annual Honolulu AIDS Walk. Just want to say that this is the 40th anniversary of the Life Foundation. Many of you have been supporters of the Life Foundation, and now the 5th anniversary of the Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center. 40 years of fighting HIV in Hawaii and the Pacific, and really just want to appreciate every one of you for taking time on your Saturday. And if we could just end with a moment of silence for those that are not with us to walk today, those that have lives have lost from HIV or from hate because of who they are.
The Life Foundation was set up in the middle of a public health crisis to nimbly respond to a disease that was killing our community and that nobody really knew what was happening. And in a lot of ways, Dr. McEwen and the dedicated group of advocates that came together and said, people are dying. Dr. McEwen's contacts on the continent started to better understand what from, and ending HIV, supporting people living with HIV, ending stigma, that was more important than anything. And now, obviously, with Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center, we've broadened our mission broader than HIV, but I feel like we've continued to benefit from that spirit.
Even though we are now Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center, right, we have to know our roots, where we came from, why we're even here, which was the Life Foundation and the Child Project, right, we're this merged entity. But people need to know our history and how we got to become HHHRC.
One of the things I remember all the time in the early days, I kept thinking, I can't wait to see the headline, they found the cure for AIDS. And you know what? That's not how it happened. It's been drips and drabs. They found this, they got this test, and then, this pill, and then PrEP. But we have certainly made progress, but it can go backwards. So we cannot forget the past.
I try to imagine this young group of gay men getting together in 82 and 83, especially because it was so early, like how they moved from fear, people are dying, to like, we're doing something. I'd be really curious about that pivot and how they can move out of that paralysis of fear into action so quickly. Because I don't know about you, but I was pretty scared about HIV.
Okay, you think? This was all parking. The whole thing was parking. And right here was one of the small hotels that had been developed and became a gay residence.
So right here was the entrance. This was the entrance to Hula's. It was a beautiful little place. It's the first bar that I ever saw that was gay in my life, and that was in 1977. It was one of the places I used to hang out for many years, along with everybody else in the world. This whole little area here was the center of this little gay community. And as it's gone through development, it's saddened me and lots of other people to see it change. But that is the story of the human race.
When we started Hula's in 1974, people asked me if Hula's was the first gay bar, and it wasn't by far. There was many gay bars here. Waikiki back in those days was a gay tourist destination. And it was because people knew that they could be accepted. And it was pre-AIDS, so people were just love, sex, and rock and roll. It was just sort of the right time. The thing about AIDS here in Waikiki and Honolulu is that it was a mainland problem. People weren't even talking about it. Condoms were for straight people.
I started practice in Hawaii on September 1st, 1977. I just arrived in Hawaii. It was a childhood dream of mine to come here. I kind of was inspired by Father Damien and the stories about him, and I wanted to study it better. And then I started work, and within a year, I started getting primarily men with lymph nodes in their neck area mainly, and in their armpit and their groin. And it's kind of lymphadenopathy kind of syndrome, and like what's going on. And of course, we didn't have any idea what was going on. But in 1981-2, I had my first patient develop what was initially GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Subsequently, it was called AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And that was the first case.
At the very beginning, it wasn't on top of anybody's mind, except people slowly getting sick. And then people were not slowly getting sick very quickly in succession. It was like putting out a fire. You'd throw water on the fire on one place, and then you'd have to go and throw it on a fire in another place. And then you'd see somebody walking down the street and they had purple blotches on them. And then you'd see somebody with oxygen. And then we'd start having to go to funerals. And the funerals were like once a week sometimes. And there was also times when families and churches and the government, especially the federal government, wouldn't help these people. And so as it was becoming more and more prevalent, my business at Hula's went down to zero. With this unknown disease, business just dropped off because nobody knew how you got it. And you didn't know if you would get it on the dance floor if someone sweated on you.
Met with a bunch of my local friends here. Even though I was practicing medicine, I obviously had developed friends within the LGBT community. And a bunch of us sat down and started talking about what this is all about. What could we, what should we, who do we approach, how do we network, how do we create something to deal with this? And there were, of course, everybody had an opinion on various things, but everyone's goal was a principled and a caring wish to help people, and we had no idea where this thing was going to go.
In the early days of helping people, all we could do is assuage their hardship. It was a death sentence. One of my best friends, his name was Adam Barron. You know, he was one of the first people that I knew to succumb to AIDS. First, he was at Queen's Hospital. He was in isolation. Just to watch him, you know, wither away and die so quickly. And it was, you know, we all felt so helpless. And then when he died, I wanted to do something. I had no idea that there was going to be so many people who die. Each death was so horrible because these were young people in their teens, and 20s, and 30s dying. And there were so many creative people. And Adam Barron represented that.
Every single patient had a story that was tragic. And that's the truth. That happened a lot during this disease. There's so many other gay men, and I had some women as well. And it was an incredibly emotional experience that going on for years and years and years and years. We started putting together an organization. We didn't know what to call it, and at one of our meetings with a bunch of the attorneys, and we were trying to sign documents, the idea came to me to call it Life Foundation, because in the Jewish faith, l'chaim is kind of a toast when you're at a meal, and which means to life, as I understand it. And I thought, well, just call it a Life Foundation, because that's what we are all about. We want to save lives.
It wasn't too much longer that we actually became a nonprofit corporation. And one of our volunteer attorneys, Kirk Kashmir, who died in the early days of AIDS himself, and David Brustein, who is still around with us, did the legal work for us. And so the first board meeting was held at my house on my dining room table.
The thinking was that this is going to be around for a long time. We got to establish a foundation that's going to be able to do that. We've got to raise significant money. At some point, we're going to have to get a facility, and we're going to have to get more staff because the number of people that are requesting services is growing.
A big part of the problem is denial of risk. The thought that only certain people get AIDS can be dangerous because it's not who we are that determines our risk. It's what we do.
The initial days of the Life Foundations is one where there really was quite a bit of fear out there. And in the community, there was a lack of knowledge. And I think there was also a lot of sick people. They really didn't have the means to take care of themselves medically or personally.
I think at the beginning, it was, I guess, shocking more than anything else that we were seeing all these young gay men becoming ill and then dying. So I think we basically took care of people. We couldn't cure them, but we took care of them, and we met some of their needs of what they needed at that time.
There was people that got sick so quickly and they couldn't work anymore and they couldn't pay their electric bill or just the basic necessities, food. and the royal court came together, and they would do fundraisers, and they would just hand people money that needed money for basic utilities and rent and food. I remember one time I had a friend who was very, 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 very wealthy, and I asked him for a donation, and he says, "Is it okay if I write it out to cash, because I don't want my bookkeeper to know that I'm doing this?" I mean, that's how hard it was to raise money. You'd have an event, and you go to businesses, and businesses, "No, I don't want to donate. I don't want to have my name connected with this."
Besides Hula's, there was a lady by the name Pat who had a lesbians bar. And Pat actually, to my imperfect memory, put on the first fundraiser for Life Foundation.
There was grassroots support. People went to some length to put on small benefits.
Jack Law, when we were trying to decide how we were going to be spending our money, you know, what percentage goes to the patients and services, and different people wanted to run books different ways. And one time he stood up at a meeting, he says, "That's not how you run a business." And whatever we were arguing about at the time, we're just like, okay, well, we got to listen to Jack. We're doing compassionate work, but we're running a business. And the laws of numbers never changes no matter what your business is. And so Jack was very good at the very, very early stages of guiding on that.
You know, our first employee only came about 5 years into the project. I mean, everybody was volunteer. And even after that, there were very few employees going into the mid-90s. It was a very difficult job being on the board of directors at the time. I mean, I think anybody who's on a board of directors where you're an officer and it's a service organization, it was a lot of work. I think your average member of the board was tasked with an enormous amount of, hey, provide services. Hey, provide services. That made it a really difficult endeavor.
What we were doing is trying to fill people's needs, and also try to create legislation in the Hawaii legislature that would be better than some of the legislation that hit the mainland state legislatures.
The need was really extreme, and that led sometimes to problems of like, what's the purpose of this group? Are we really here to lobby the legislature? Or are we here to help our comrades and friends who are having a really hard time with the disease? And the answer that we always came up with was we had to do both. If we didn't, we were going to end up in bad situations.
A lot of the AIDS organizations were upset because the rules to protect people if they're HIV positive hadn't been created nationally. And the Life Foundation's volunteers, Kirk Kashmir, David Brustein, and a bunch of others got together and said, okay, we're going to write the laws.
Basically, how I came into this area, actually it was David McEwen who brought me into the area of getting interested in AIDS law. And one of the chronic problems with AIDS that we saw early on was the problem of discrimination in a number of areas.
There was always a huge amount of stuff coming out in the way of science. And despite the politicians which were filled with homophobia, both in our own legislature and nationally, the science and the caring and the love of people with good hearts continued to dominate the scene.
Initially, I was very angry and felt that there was a lot of denial going on at the highest levels in our country. But there were still quality physicians and researchers who were involved right from the very beginning, who laid their careers on the line and didn't have any funds and put their brains into it. They were the initial pioneers. We've moved along. The government, albeit reluctantly at times, has added more funds over time. And what I see is a real logarithmic climb of the amount of information. It's really very, very exciting.
It was really a very slow process, but it was always forward. I think we were slapped down a couple times, but we were always able to go forward. It was because the need was so great. And also, I think pretty soon everybody realized on the island that it can affect anybody.
We have a whole bunch of questions here about, will this cause AIDS? Will this get me AIDS? Will this get it? I'll have to ask the doctors of all these questions.
I would just hope that everyone would get the facts. I would hope that every parent, every minister, every grandmother and grandfather get out there and talk to their kids. Because think about it, if you got a 10 to 15 year incubation period, what is destined for this state and this nation and this globe for the next 15 years is already in place. You can't do anything about it. It's too late. So we're working on 2005, 2010 right now.
We went from a totally volunteer operation to, first we got one executive director, Then we got an executive director and an assistant. And then we got caseworkers. Slowly, as we were able to get the funds, we were able to do more and more.
So Jack Law talked with Bob Magoon and said we needed a place with the Life Foundation. We had a name by then. The Magoon family owned some property over here, just one block over, next to this pink building you can see on the left. The main portion of the work that was going on with the staff and the volunteers and was in the first house, and that actually began right here, probably came to about where this tree is right here. So it was a fairly wide one-story house. So it was a great location and people, ill or well, could go over to Hula's or Hamburger Mary to get their lunch or drink or to just have fun. So there was happiness and laughter next to the tragedy. It's a precious place.
The Life Foundation provides several different kinds of services. We do provide education. We have speakers who can go into the community, into businesses, the workplaces, into the schools. Our education department also has a speakers bureau of people who are infected with HIV. And sometimes these people can really be most effective in addressing children, for instance.
Sometimes living with AIDS can be just too much, and you need someone to talk to. Hi, I'm Daryl, a buddy with the Life Foundation. Buddies provide companionship and support for those living with AIDS. You too can be a buddy. Call the Life Foundation for more information.
You know, one of the things that we did in the early days that I think was really effective, Doug Simonson, he was the guy who drew Peppo of Pigeon to the Max. He did a colored comic book that talked about AIDS, and it was given out to different schools that would take them.
Initially, the Life Foundation started an education and prevention program that was developed in the schools. Department of Education took things the next step. So they have a very active program in the public school system. The Life Foundation continues to go into the private schools to provide the kinds of information that I think our teenagers need to make good decisions about their lives.
You know, David, it's really worth remembering too that there were supportive people inside the Department of Health. Oh, absolutely. So not only did we have Dr. Lewin, who was extremely supportive and worked with us to try to come up with creative solutions.
You know, the Life Foundation and the Department of Health were actually quite natural partners. The Department of Health, of course, came from a surveillance perspective. What the Life Foundation brought was that experience with working for quite a few years with individual people that were living with and actually dying with HIV or AIDS, as it was called at the time. They also brought the community perspective, how people collectively felt about what they were going through.
The medical trends are showing that AIDS is moving from a fatal illness into hopefully a chronic but manageable illness. And this is a big turning point at the beginning of the 90s for the history of AIDS.
Many people are concerned that their test may be positive and they simply don't want to know. We need to let these people know that now there's a definite reason to be tested, that if they take preventive treatment, they can extend their lives.
You know, one of the quotes you hear a lot is ignorance spreads AIDS. And AIDS is a 100% preventable disease. Unfortunately, it's a disease that involves changes in behavior that are very difficult for people to change. Sexual behaviors, drug dependency is a very serious problem.
One of the first things that we did in the early days was do needle exchange. We were one of the first AIDS organizations in the country to make that legal. We were doing it illegally before. And it kept us from having one pediatric AIDS case.
Hotel Street, a marketplace of sex, drugs, and disease. It's one of the areas health professionals are zeroing in on to stem the tide of the deadly AIDS virus. Enter Aaron Peak. 2 years ago, Peak came to Hotel Street under the auspices of the Life Foundation. His mission? To slow the spread of AIDS and save lives.
Do you think that there are people out there who would do drugs more often where there are more availability of needles?
No, I don't see that as a concern at all. Reason being is if they're going to be shooting drugs, they're going to be shooting drugs regardless whether it's a needle exchange or not. Chances are with the needle exchange, they'll be just doing it with clean injecting apparatus.
Aaron Peak was one of the original outreach workers for Life Foundation, and he worked out of what was called the Rubber Room. And yeah, the formal contract, when it became legal in Hawaii in 93, and when the legislature passed it, that went to the Child Project. But it was actually Life Foundation and Aaron Peak who started syringe access in Hawaii. They realized that people were dying, that people weren't getting the things they needed, whether it was condoms or needles, to save their lives, and so they did it. And they did it at risk of arrest.
I'm still not convinced. I haven't seen enough stats that have told me that this program is successful, is stopping the spread of AIDS, is also not perpetuating drug use.
Well, actually, the Child Project they interview people when they first see them, then they interview them again 6 months or 9 months later, and they find that they are shooting up less, they are using less drugs, and they are changing their behavior.
Pam Lichty, Jane Bopp, Darlene Hine, and Tracy Ryan were the 4 fierce harm reduction women who launched the first ever harm reduction conference, which was in 1995. Jane got into harm reduction through Life Foundation, being the first prevention director, really doing a lot of work with sex workers at the time.
When I was the director of HIV prevention at the Life Foundation, it was not an easy job at all. We were practicing on the edge, and it required constant self-reflection on my part and on my staff's part to question if what we were doing was right. During those times, even up through maybe the Clinton era, harm reduction was a dirty word. We could not say it and get federal funding. So we could not say what we wanted to do was harm reduction because the populations were considered taboo and they were so demonized. It was a really hard time, and it was a really, really sad time, but it was also a very exciting and progressive time.
I'm a Chow, a community health outreach worker. I want to assist you in saving your own life. As a Chow, it's not my business to judge what you do, but to encourage you to do it safely. Please, stay alive. We want to help.
I think we laid a really good foundation, a foundation that could be built on for the future. And I think that's what ended up happening.
When Paul Groesbeck took over, I mean, it was a smaller organization. Paul made it into a much bigger organization, was able to provide much more adequate services.
Hi, I'm Paul Groesbeck. I'm the executive director of the Life Foundation, which is the AIDS service organization on the island of Oahu.
Paul Groesbeck is one of the best bosses I've ever had. He was generous and he was open and he was willing to take risks because people were dying. I mean, this was serious. This was life and death. And sorry. And so he was willing to be very progressive and to be a risk taker.
He often had these wise sayings that pretty much settled conversations. That my favorite of Paul's, when we were looking at how we should spend the money or what kind of programs we should be supporting, he said, you know, you should always build sidewalks where people walk. And I absolutely loved that, and it was so appropriate. Throughout the whole epidemic is that we should be looking and learning from the people that have HIV. We should be learning from the people that are at risk for HIV. And that's where we should be following with our programs and our services.
The agency really was progressive in that way in the 90s because they saw that the whole trend of HIV was starting to affect a different part of the community. So I know that the agency realized that they have to adapt. And a lot of that was because of Paul, because of people like Jane Bopp, and because of Kelsey Maria, the director at the time.
I think at the Life Foundation, we're trying to be more sensitive to the Asian and Pacific Islander people. In the case management section, we're planning to hire a person of Native Hawaiian descent to go out into the communities in Waianae, Waimanalo, and do outreach as well as provide services. It's not just a gay white male disease anymore. And as the intake person, I see that a lot of local people are starting to come in.
We were doing harm reduction before it was even sexy. So people should enjoy themselves without worry about anything. So I started as an outreach worker, doing outreach to the places where the boys were playing with the boys in the bushes. It was important to me to make sure I did my prevention and outreach work in these rural areas, like in Hauula, where I still live, because there was no one else doing it. And because no one was doing it or talking about it, people just were unaware.
A lot of our local communities didn't see HIV as
a health issue. A lot of the previous media really that contained any kind of HIV information really showed a Caucasian side of HIV infection, which a lot of our community don't identify with. So a lot of them didn't think this was an issue that they should be concerned about. My program manager at that time, Carol McKinai, she was really the driving force of the entire Native Hawaiian program. I think she is the reason why it existed and why it still exists today.
I think because we're such a small state and people, you know, a lot of people are really closely related or know people who know people, you know, there's a lot more shame involved. And there was a comment made at one time that condoms aren't the answer, morals are. And like Paul said, you know, AIDS is not a moral issue. The behavior takes place.
The things that we were talking about was not acceptable back in the syringe exchange, no. Substance use, like even multiple sex partners, it was something that shook everybody when we talked to them. But that's what we did. That's how we made progress.
We got to tell people there is no shame. We started something last year called the No Shame campaign, which we're going to keep going. It's getting some traction, I think, and part of it is not so public. Part of it is just going to the various gatekeepers in different ethnic communities and saying, you got to help us.
One of the things that was tasked to me was to make it more accessible to our local LGBTQ community. And that's how we started Utopia Hawaii. I started with Rodney Powell, Monoiki Ani, and I flew up to San Francisco and I looked at the Pacific Islanders up there and I was like, what brings them together? What would bring us together and make HIV more accessible? And so that's how we created this community group, which was truly groundbreaking in really making the agency front-facing, inclusive of the API community. So it was sort of like this color shift, I would say, for our organization and for the HIV movement.
We're really making a special effort to make sure those people who have difficulty accessing services are able to do that. And part of the way we do it is working through organizations like the Life Foundation, who have outreach workers who don't wait for people to come in, but actually go out and actually work with those populations and try and bring them into service.
The case management side hired from the community. You know, we had all ranges of folks that were on there. And what I liked is that they didn't really focus on hiring people with a degree. They really hired people that had like a heart for the community.
I didn't know much about case management, so I had to figure out how to do this. And part of it was to advocate for our clients. So I went to the hospital, and one of the hospitals here was going to discharge their patient, my client, and they were going to just discharge him to the streets, and he was really sick. I thought, okay, well, if you're going to do that, that's not a safe discharge. And the response that I got was, well, we're not a housing agency, so we don't have to. My response to that was, I speak fluent Department of Health and you better watch what you say. So I ran back over here and I told my executive director, Paul Grossbeck, what I said. And he was in agreement with me. And that's when I knew that I was in the right place. Where harm reduction is. Harm reduction was the base of Life Foundation. It's the base of H3RC. Any way that we could reduce harm is the way that we needed to go.
When I became the director of Life Foundation in 1992, the HIV positive people we were helping, there were 300 when I started, they were almost exclusively gay white males, almost exclusively people from the mainland. Not entirely, but for the most part. 1 year later, 1/3 of those men were dead. That's the way it used to be. Now, of the 600 or so people we are helping today, only 1/3 are gay white males. Fewer than half are Caucasian people. The disease in Hawaii, as it has in the mainland, has migrated ethnically, culturally, economically, and unfortunately has migrated in some cases to groups that don't get as much attention or that people, the government, or people in general don't seem to care about.
It was really important for the community to walk into the doors at Life Foundation and see themselves reflected in the staff there. You know, at times it could make for being complicated because Hawaii is such a small place. And within the LGBT and Mahu community, we do all know each other. We are all familiar with each other. And so in those instances, it can be a little bit complicated. But when the rubber hit the road and anyone was really in need of information or testing or case management or guidance, that's where we all turned to. We really knew that they were there to make things better for us. The leadership at Life Foundation always trusted to listen to their staff that came from the community. You know, I think that sometimes when we were working there, we didn't even know our own value. I didn't know that I had anything to contribute or to offer. I didn't know that my experiences, no matter how heavy and traumatic that they were really, really important pieces of the puzzle of creating an environment that was welcoming to people like me. And luckily, Life Foundation knew that. Luckily, Kunane and Trisha, and Nandi and Heather and Paul, they all knew that.
Aren't you having trouble getting people to pay attention, to getting young people or the most sexually active people to pay attention now?
Yes, we are. I think complacency is the big issue. It's not over, but it can be over if we keep working on it. And in Hawaii in particular, and I think people watching this program have to realize, this can be beaten.
I look at the evolution of the foundation over time, and I think it's gone really well. While Life Foundation merged with the Child Project, from my own perspective, this was really great stuff. It was a group that if it continued to be a foundation just focused on HIV, it would have been a shrinking presence, just because we have been so successful.
When we merged, I don't think any of us could imagine getting rid of the name Life Foundation. That name was so aligned with the work, with the people, and with the movement that moving past it seemed unthinkable. However, over time, it actually was the clients and the staff who felt that we'll never lose the name or connection of Life Foundation, but that it was really time to let go.
I knew in order for us to survive as an agency and to continue to grow, that we needed to change the name, change our mission, change all of that, because our people no longer just needed HIV services. There's always sentimental piece in my heart around Life Foundation. I mean, look, it's been 5 years, I still haven't gotten rid of my polo shirts, right? I mean, there's always gonna be in my heart a place for Life Foundation. I think my kuleana is to make sure that the people know and remember who Life Foundation was.
Dr. McEwen was kind of like a person on a pedestal that we looked up to because, you know, he founded this, and he founded it during a time which was much more scary than when I was there.
There were these heroes around the country and here in Dr. McEwen and Jack Law that just saw that this was something that needed to be done. And over time, the baton has been passed on to so many different people, and each person had a different passion for making Life Foundation what it needed to be in that generation and in that era.
I want everybody in the Life Foundation and the broader HIV community to understand from somebody that's really been around for a long time, and I'm feeling really old talking this way, that we truly do stand on the shoulders of giants, particularly in the Life Foundation and the community that's come together to provide and support HIV services. And for you folks doing that work today, you are the giants upon which other people will be standing in the future.
This sounds a little simplistic, but I've always felt if you're going to succeed in medicine, you've got to be a messenger of knowledge and hope. And what's so fascinating, if you look where we are now compared to then, it was worth being hopeful.